Coming up on today's episode of the Real Lives podcast.
Didn't your company create a monster here that is, in fact, killing people today and turning people into addicts?
No. The monster in this country is the epidemic of untreated pain.
The rate of addiction amongst pain patients who are treated by doctors is much less than 1%.
Perhaps 1% or less of those people actually become addicted.
Fewer than 1/2 of 1%. Less than 1% ever become addicted. Studies show there's virtually no risk of addiction.
Oxycontin is one of America's new prescription wonder drugs. In the right hands, it's a powerful painkiller. In the wrong hands, it can be a killer.
So we have folks that literally will use fentanyl every 4 hours of their life just to function. Users realize that you could get these things wet, you could crush them and snort them, and you could get the entire pill immediately. You know, last year was about 75,000 people of the total 110 lost their life to opioids, specifically fentanyl.
On today's episode, I have on former DEA agent and owner of Eagle 6 Training, Brian Townsend. Now, as you can see from the intro there, I'm going to put a disclaimer in that there is a discussion of drugs, death, overdoses, all those sorts of things. So if you are sensitive to that, then maybe don't watch this, but I feel like this is a really interesting topic with a really interesting person who gives a valuable insight into what it's like to deal with the drug epidemic in America, especially the opioid problem, both from the street side of it and also from the pharmaceutical side of it as well. All Brian's links will be down in the description below, so if you want to ask him a question, feel free to email him as well. I'll provide his email in the description, so yeah, please reach out to him and enjoy the episode with Brian Townsend. Brian, welcome onto the podcast. I appreciate you coming on. Do you want to tell people who you are and what you do?
Yeah, thanks for having me on. My name is Brian Townsend, and I'm a retired law enforcement agent. Was with the Drug Enforcement Administration, the DEA, for 23 years, and prior to that, I was a police officer in Southwest Missouri for about 5 years. So 28 years total. I retired last year. And now I have my own business, do a lot of training and consulting around the world. And that's me.
Amazing. So why the DEA? What drew you to a career in law enforcement?
I'd actually been interested in law enforcement when I was younger, high school age. Didn't know how I was going to accomplish that, but I had an interest in it. Actually worked with a woman whose husband worked at the FBI Academy in Quantico, Virginia. I grew up and went to school probably 20, 30 minutes from Quantico, Virginia, which is where the FBI and DEA Academy is. And they weren't given tours, but he worked there for a long time and was able to set up a special visit for me with the FBI. And when I was there, I saw the DEA guys, and that was what I decided that's what I wanted to do. Just had this interest in law enforcement. Again, I didn't know how I was going to accomplish that goal. During college, I had some friends that were getting into law enforcement after their degree, and they recommended a local law enforcement route, being a police officer, which I'd never considered. I always thought I was going to go DEA or some type of federal agency. But again, I didn't know how that route would go. But I thought, well, local law enforcement sounds fun. And I did that, and it was great. I worked for the Joplin Police Department, which is in Southwest Missouri, and a great police department, great city, a lot of experience. But after 5 years, I was ready to move on to the DEA, and I was fortunate enough to get hired and spent the next 23 years of my very rewarding career with the DEA.
Amazing. So what was it that drew you to law enforcement then? What about it was like the thing that made you tick?
Helping people, helping communities. My interest was drugs. I saw what drugs were doing to people.
Was that first-hand experience?
Yeah.
Sort of, close friends, family, that kind of thing? Or was it like just you were seeing in the streets what was going on?
More in the streets. I had a good family. Didn't have mom and dad addicted to drugs or siblings that were using drugs. But I did see it in the community I lived in. Didn't grow up poor, but I certainly didn't grow up rich either. And drugs impact every community, and they certainly impacted my neighborhood growing up, and I saw what they did firsthand to friends and neighbors, and just had an interest in working to combat that problem. And again, I didn't even know what the DEA was at the time, but yeah, just that interest grew, sparked from there, really.
So during the early years, what was the main problem that you were facing? Because obviously, compared to now, it's probably a very, very different scenario.
Absolutely, a lot of hallucinogens, marijuana, which interestingly was not as potent as the marijuana of today is, but a lot of pills, which are a problem now, but different types of pills, more of the, like I said, a lot of the hallucinogens, the LSD, ECP, things like that. I'm not as old as I may look, but the drugs are definitely different when I was young than they are now.
Yeah, because obviously now, so one of the main things that I want to get into is this opioid epidemic that the world is facing, really. But before that, so obviously with this, the rise in pills at the time, obviously the hallucinogens and things like that, and marijuana, which is now obviously legal in some states. What was the most frustrating thing about dealing with those things? Was it the sort of rapid rise in them, or was it more trying to police it, so to speak?
Yeah, probably a little bit of both. Just seeing firsthand what they did to people. You know, these drugs are very addictive, and they just take over, and people make really bad decisions after taking the drug. Taking the drug is a bad decision, but you know, and then to keep that habit, you know, they get involved with you know, crime, theft, burglaries, things like that, just so they can afford to purchase more drugs. And it's just the devastation it does on the person and then the family. You know, they lose loved ones, they steal from loved ones, so they destroy those relationships, and then it's just the other crime, I call it the collateral damage, the associated crimes that drugs bring. I mean, just all of it really is disheartening to see.
So what was your role then within the DEA during those early years?
So I joined the DEA as a special agent. I was a criminal investigator. So I investigated drug crimes. And our role at the DEA is to go as high as we can in the, let's say, call it the food chain, the organizational chart. You know, ultimately we want to get to the folks responsible for distributing the drugs. And that typically is like the cartels, or at least that level of an organization. You know, we go after violent organizations, violent persons who distribute drugs in our communities.
How hard is it to actually capture the guys at the top of the ring, so to speak? Because obviously you see in these different shows where they're looking to prosecute these entire sort of organizations, but it always starts with the guys at the bottom who don't know much, so it's very hard to get information out of them. Then it's the guys just above them and above them and above them, and then it's like years and years down the line before they actually get the guy that they want. So where do you even start when you come to realize there's a new organization?
Yeah, you try to start as high as you can. I'd say most of the time you're probably mid-level. You know, you have someone that is not small, at least for a DEA investigation. You know, they're moving a considerable amount of weight, but they're probably not the largest either. You know, that maybe there was someone who was arrested and cooperated and gave us information on someone, or maybe they were arrested themselves and decided to cooperate and gave us information. But it takes time. I mean, I worked investigations that literally took years before we saw prosecution, but ideally it's several defendants. It's I don't like single defendant cases. You know, if we're only arresting one person and moving on, then, you know, what are we doing? We really need to target the organizations as a whole. And we have some incredible federal laws in the United States, like conspiracy laws. And we use those to target these organizations. But it's very difficult to go after them. But we've had a lot of success. Law enforcement, I mean, look at the Sinaloa cartel. I know it's still a very dangerous cartel, but El Chapo, I mean, now he's rotting in prison, where hopefully he'll...
So. Yeah. There's been a recent thing, hasn't there, about the fact that he's been trying to communicate somewhat with his sons or something, because obviously they're now they're in hiding because they're probably facing the same thing that he is, where they'll be rotting in prison for the rest of their lives.
Yeah, that, and just there's a lot of fighting for control of the Sinaloa cartel between them and other folks who felt like they were in that that command structure of the organization, and so yeah, it's but still a deadly cartel, and still one that brings in a lot of fentanyl into the United States. The other cartel of interest is CJNG, which has gotten a lot of. They're using El Chapo's arrests and all the associated internal fighting to try to take more ground, more territory, and be the number one.
As obviously a special agent for the United States and an organization that runs within the United States, how much harder is it dealing with organizations such as the Sinaloan cartel, whereby obviously they're under completely different jurisdiction with being in Mexico?
You know, that's one thing that DEA we have a great relationship with many countries. I mean, I don't know the exact number, but I think we're in 86 or 87 countries that we work with the governments. You know, we have offices in the consulate or the embassies, and you know, our interest is stopping the importation of drugs into the United States, and we also want to gather intelligence and figure out what's the overall drug landscape look like in the world, and how's that impact the United States, and how can we use that intelligence to help the host nations that we work with in their fight against drugs and crime as well. But you know, we have some success down there. There are some I can't say there's not some roadblocks and some problems, especially in Mexico with corruption, and there's been a lot of political things that have happened in the last few years, specifically with the DEA and some top members of their government. But there are a lot of good people down there, a lot of men and women who are dedicated to making their country safer, and you know, thankfully those people exist and are risking their lives to make Mexico a better place.
Yeah, I was going to say that's probably one of the hardest things within a country like Mexico, where the cartels hold so much control over certain aspects of the country that these people are still willing to provide information, even though it would mean that probably them and their entire families would be murdered for the fact that they've given information. Absolutely.
It's very courageous, very noble of those people, but that's how much they care about their country and care about, you know, making it a better place.
Going back to obviously all the drug aspect and specific drugs, you mentioned fentanyl. So at what point were drugs such as fentanyl on the rise? Because like me, growing up as a kid, you hear about like cocaine and meth and things, like you hear about these drugs in the news. You never, and then all of a sudden, I think it was probably like 3 or 4 years ago, fentanyl just blew up and it was everywhere. It was in everything. So when did it become a huge thing on your side?
We actually started seeing fentanyl more around the 2013 time frame, about 10 years ago.
Okay.
I mean, it'd been around prior to that, illicit fentanyl, but where it was at noticeable levels, where we started seeing it more in our lab reports, was around the 2013 time frame, and it was originally just a cut in heroin. I mean, the everything about fentanyl is very close to heroin. I mean, they're opioids, and slowly, beginning, I'd say about 2013, we started seeing more and more fentanyl, where it was replacing the heroin because it's a synthetic. And what I mean by that, there's no longer a need for the plant or any type of chemical synthesis from the plant to let's say a pharmaceutical. It's just chemicals. It's a lot easier to make. So you're not dealing with the plants or the logistics or any of the problems with associated with that. And it's the chemicals are easy to obtain, especially you know, the cartels obtain them in bulk quantities from China primarily. It's not hard to make, and they already have the distribution routes set up. I mean, the same distribution routes we see for cocaine and methamphetamine and some marijuana from Mexico into the United States already exist. So you know, they already have the infrastructure set up, and yeah, they move record amounts into the United States now. But yeah, so about 10 years ago is when we really started seeing it take over. And now, at least in the United States, heroin is very difficult to find. Very, very difficult to find. In fact, it's interesting. You talk to some of the users or people that get arrested and cooperate, and they'll tell you that we'd love to have heroin again, but fentanyl has just taken over.
So what is it about fentanyl, other than obviously it's easier to make and stuff? What is it that is more addictive about it? And also, am I right in saying it's cheaper to make, which is why they now lace it in things such as you can find it in cocaine, you can find it in, obviously, in place of heroin and things like that?
Yeah, absolutely cheaper to make and wildly addictive. I mean, opioids in general are very addictive, and fentanyl it works on very short duration. So on average, about 4 hours. So we have folks that literally will use fentanyl every 4 hours of their life just to function.
Wow.
And it doesn't take a lot either. I mean, you look at medical grade fentanyl, which is good, by the way. Primarily in the patches or the lollipops. I mean, the reason they wear the patches, especially like cancer patients who need it, is it releases a very, very, very small amount of fentanyl into the body over an extended period of time. Where illicit fentanyl, they can't take a lot because it'll kill them, but it's just incredibly powerful at very small amounts. But again, for short durations, so they're constantly using it. So more people are going to die because I'm sure we'll talk about it, but it doesn't take a lot of fentanyl to kill you. Only literally about 2 milligrams of fentanyl, which is just a few granules of salt or sand, literally just 2 milligrams. But the traffickers, the cartels, they don't care. They don't care about human life. This isn't about, trying to make push drugs in society for any good. It's all about the money. So for every person they kill, they know they're making more addicts. And that's ultimately what this is about, is the money.
It's crazy that a drug so potent and so powerful has obviously come to be one of the most addictive in the world. And the fact that we thought heroin was as bad as it was, and then now there's this sort of heroin on steroids, so to speak, that is just completely taken over. And you can see the effects on people's lives. Like where I live currently in Melbourne, you can see that like people are folded over in the streets and they just can't move. Like where I live it's not like a very well off area, and you can really see it. There's constantly police and ambulance around because people have overdosed and got into fights or like because of drugs. And it's just crazy to see how it affects the world so quickly.
Absolutely. It really is. It's devastating communities, families and communities. And it's killing folks. It's poisoning folks, especially our young folks. Our adolescents have a greater chance of dying now of drugs, specifically fentanyl, than any other age group. It's incredible. I mean, in the United States alone, we lose 300 people a day to drug poisoning. And about 2/3 of that is because of opioids. And when I say opioid, I probably ought to just say fentanyl, because that is the opioid that's killing everyone. So, I mean, last year in this country alone, we lost 110,000 people. It's a record high.
Yeah.
When I was a police officer, we lost 4,000 or 5,000 people a year. And I'm not minimizing those people. I mean, but it's a small amount compared to where we are now. I mean, it has literally changed the drug landscape, really, of the world.
Yeah, I was looking at an article yesterday about the opioid epidemic, and they reported that in 2021, 75% of overdoses in the US were opioid related, and there was something like over 200 people per day overdosed from opioids, and that is a wild stat.
Absolutely, I agree. And sometimes we have a hard time wrapping our head around those numbers. So, when I talk to folks about opioids and fentanyl, and I start with the number of people who have been poisoned to death by this, I give those numbers. And then, last year was about 75,000 people of the total 110 lost their life to opioids, specifically fentanyl. And in American football is a big deal. And most of the NFL stadiums I live in Missouri. Our stadium, Kansas City, holds about 76,000 people. Arrowhead Stadium with the Kansas City Chiefs. So I always tell folks, think of your football stadium. That next time you're at a game, look around. That 75,000 people is what we're losing every year because of fentanyl. It's staggering, incredible.
Yeah, when you put it like that, it's you can't comprehend it, really, can you?
No.
Just that to think that every single person in that stadium, if you were to put like that into they would just be dead as a result of opioids. It's wild.
Yeah, pretty sad.
So, in terms of from the DEA's perspective, when obviously you started to see more lab reports coming in of like these more fentanyl and things, and that heroin was actually being sort of replaced, what was your reaction to that, and how did you begin to deal with it?
At first, I don't think the law enforcement community we were kind of blindsided by it. And I think when we realized something was happening, I really think we were drinking from fire hoses. We were trying to respond. And our laws really hadn't caught up to it at the time either. I mean, it took a lot of these drugs to get any type of federal prosecution. But it was a challenge. And like I said, I think it kind of snuck up on us. We started seeing fentanyl more and more in our lab reports, and then there was the concern that there was a danger to law enforcement and first responders just to be around the drug, like literally just to be around it. And then we start seeing a huge spike in deaths, and really around 2016. If you look at the number of people who were dying from opioids, at least in the United States, it was 2,000 or 3,000 people a year, consistently, probably for 20 years. And then, like I said, around that 2013 time period, if you start looking at those numbers and you put that on a graph, it's literally like this flat line, couple thousand people a year, and then all of a sudden it just turns up and just goes vertical, where we're at 75,000 people a year now. We went from 2,000 to 75,000 people almost overnight. So yeah, in law enforcement, that's what we noticed, is the number of people that were dying. But again, I mean, I as much as I'd like to say we were prepared for it, we weren't. I mean, we weren't. It was tough. It was a lot of challenges. These cases were hard to make, but we, there's a lot of dedicated men and women in law enforcement who did a great job and continue to do a great job targeting these organizations that, especially the ones that are bringing in a lot of fentanyl in.
What does the projection look like for the sort of the next 5 to 10 years of how bad this could get?
Our 2021 numbers to 2022 didn't jump as high as even myself thought they would. They're still too high. I'm not trying to minimize these folks who've lost their lives. But we went from about 109,000 people a year to 110,000 people a year. So if there's any good out of that, if you want to call it good, is the fact that it wasn't as high. But I tell you what, I still think, and I hope I'm wrong. I hope you find me in a couple of years and laugh in my face and tell me I'm wrong. But I still think it's going to go higher. And the bigger concern is I mentioned earlier, the adolescents, the kids. I read a lot of studies and things like that, and every single study I can find shows the number of kids turning to drugs and alcohol to cope with stress and anxiety and just life's problems, mental illness, things like that, is staggering. There's a study that came out last year in the United States that said 44% of teenagers feel persistent feelings of sadness and loneliness. And then I thought, well, let's look pre-COVID. Pre-COVID in 2019, it was about 36.7%. So about 37% of teenagers who literally, and it's quote, feel persistent feelings of sadness and loneliness. And why I mention that is because what do these kids turn to when they feel sad, when they feel lonely? Drugs and alcohol. I mean, they tell you that in surveys year after year after year. University of Michigan does one. I mean, it's amazing. And it's scary because a lot of these kids are going to use drugs that are going to be laced with fentanyl, and they're going to die from first-time drug use. It's already happening. And that's why the mortality rate for young folks is so high, is because, think about it, if you use drugs in your life, it was more experimenting with drugs or used drugs, or at least when you started, it was more than likely in your adolescent years. And now you have these kids who are feeling sad and they're feeling lonely, and they're dealing with mental health issues, especially in this country, because we don't help our mental health folks very much. They turn to drugs, and now we have the landscapes change where we have fentanyl laced in everything, and they're turning to a drug, and they're using Percocets and Lorcets and Adderall and Xanax and you name it. And all it takes is 2 milligrams for them to die. So this isn't your typical, stereotypical drug user who's, laying in an alley, which, that happens as well. But these are your kids who are going to school, they're playing sports, and for whatever reason, they decide to experiment with drugs, which, like I said, happens most likely in their teenage years. And they're literally dying from first-time drug use because 2 milligrams is enough to kill the average person. It's incredible. It's staggering. So I know this is a long-winded answer, but in the next 5 years, I sadly, I think we're going to see more and more of those statistics, especially in our younger people. I hope I am wrong. I truly, but if you look back in the last 5, 10, 15 years, that's what we're seeing.
Yeah, I think as well, it's crazy to say it, but when you correlate it with the rise of social media, which means that people are connected in one aspect, but they lose the connection in another, because you look now and you see it in kids where they're out with friends, but they've got like earphones in. And like I said to my brother a few months ago, I was like, that is wild to me that like you're out with your friends and you will not you can't take whatever's going on in here out. So they're like, there's no connection. There's no actual whether it be mental or physical connection with whoever that you're with. And then they just sit, you see them, they sit together and they'll just scroll and scroll and scroll. And there's no wonder that really they feel lonely and they feel alone. And it's like, then you look at it like, so they're now feeling lonely because of this. They feel like they've got no friends or what have you. And then it's like, what do I do? And it's like, in that moment, probably it's just probably a lapse in judgment more than anything, that then they turn to this thing that they see as like, it'll cloud it for me or whatever that may be. Yeah. And like, obviously I'm not saying it's just social media that's caused that. It's obviously other things, but I think it's a massive problem in terms of how it's making the younger generation feel, and then how they're then dealing with that.
I couldn't agree more. We are losing the power of communication. I love social media, but we are literally losing this. We're losing the face-to-face contact that is so critical to human beings. And it's sad, and especially our young people, because we're not coping with struggles and failure and all the things that come from face-to-face contact. I don't have all the details, but there was a psychologist in the United States back in the 1940s or 1950s. I want to say his name was Dr. Alexander or something like that. But he did this study on rats, and it was called Rat Park. I don't know if you're familiar with it or not. But they had rats in a cage, and they had bottles in there, and they were laced with believe cocaine. And when they were put in the cages, they would consume this. There was 2 bottles. There was one with cocaine, one with water. And when they were put in these cages alone, they would literally just drink from the cocaine until they overdosed and died. Seldom would they go to the water, and if they did, they would go right back to the cocaine. Well, this psychologist came around and says, well, let's explore this a little more. So he made this thing called Rat Park. And it was not just a cage with one rat, it was a cage with a lot of rats. So they could do whatever rats do, have sex, go on the little wheels, whatever. And he had the same 2 water bottles, or I'm sorry, the same 2 bottles in that cage, one with cocaine and one with water. And what's interesting is in this particular scenario, when they were in this park with other rats, if they went to the one with cocaine, it would just be very quick and they'd go to the water. And it was almost a reverse. And I don't remember all the details of this, but that's basically the gist of it. And what I realized, look at that power of community. And I know those are rats and not people, but I think we have that same need where we need this communication. We need this type of bond with people, and we're losing it with social media. And I love social media. Don't get me wrong. I think it's wonderful to have news at your fingertips instantly, and to communicate with people instantly. But yeah, no, I absolutely agree with you. I mean, especially our young people who don't know how to cope with things, you know, or they post a picture and maybe there's not enough likes of it, you know, and or the cyberbullying. I mean, you could go on and on and on how social media is really impacting, especially our young people.
Yeah. Going back to that, obviously the difference between rats and humans, I think we are very similar in terms of the fact that it's just animalistic tendencies. You look back at, like, you look at all types of species, majority of species work in packs. They never really function alone. It's very rare that you will see that. And it's because without that community, they feel like they can't function. And it's the same as humans. If you live on your own, and if you live far away from family, and if you live, you know, you move to a new place and you struggle to make friends or whatever that may be, ultimately you're gonna feel alone, and you're gonna feel like there's no hope, because when you've lost everything that you once had and you see it, it's like, what do I do? And then rather than, you know, seeing it as just, I can just go out and make friends, because you're already in that headspace, it's then so hard for people to go, actually, I can just go out and just go meet people and things like that. And it's even as simple as, like, you go to a bar now. How rare is it now compared to 10, 15 years ago that, like, say, a guy will just go up to a girl in a bar? It won't happen. People don't do it because they've got Tinder on the phone or whatever it may be. So it's just simple things like that now we've just lost this ability that we've had for thousands and thousands of years because of things on our phones that are now, it's just gone.
Absolutely. You hit the nail on the head. It's we've got to figure out a way to reverse that.
Absolutely. So let's also move on to, so we've talked about opioids in terms of illegal opioids. Now let's get on to the prescription opioids, because I think that is a huge problem in terms of, so when I obviously had knee surgery, two and a half weeks ago, and I was prescribed Oxycontin, and I knew it was an opioid. I knew it was like pretty heavy opioid, didn't know too much about it. And then I was taking it because of, obviously I had the bleed into the joint. It was quite painful. And as I'd taken it, I was watching Painkiller, the new documentary on Netflix. And oh my God, did that send a shock to my system? And I was like, I cannot be taking this stuff. No way can I be taking this stuff.
I got so many text messages from friends like, have you watched this yet? No, I watched A Dope Sick on Apple TV about the Sackler family and Purdue, but I haven't watched Painkiller yet, but I will. Yeah, they're very addictive. You know, under proper medical care, you know, opioids are a great thing. They do help with pain. Problem is they can be very addictive. It's interesting the stigma they carry now when people who are legitimately need them, you know, kind of question, you know, like you were saying, like, is this a good idea? You know, and unfortunately I lost my father to cancer last year. And I remember towards the end of his life, the doctor was prescribing opioids, and him and my mother were like, "Whoa, you know, we don't want that. You know, we don't get addicted." And I had to say, "Dad, you know, you're dying. You know, and as hard as that is, but it's just interesting that I saw it firsthand that reluctance, you know, to take opioids."
Yeah, from my perspective, it's because I've seen it firsthand, what it does to people. Like, so for example, my nan, she fell down the stairs. So I'm going to say it's medical neglect, but I'm not going to that's just sort of what I think it is. And she was prescribed opioids. She was on Oxycontin, and I think she was on morphine as well. And because essentially she had polio when she was a kid, and she now has what you would call post-polio syndrome. So she's in a lot of pain. And she fell down the stairs because she was so spaced out, fell down the stairs and managed to make her way to the phone to call my granddad. And my granddad was like, I'm going to call an ambulance just to make sure you're okay. And it turns out she'd broken her shoulder, but she had no idea she'd broken her shoulder because her ability to perceived pain had gone. And then it happened again where she fell, they were replacing the oven, and she fell onto the oven and shattered her wrist, and had no idea she'd shattered her wrist. And it's because of that. That's why I stopped taking it, is because it put watching Painkiller get like it more put into perspective that actually, like, at my age, feeling pain is actually a positive, because if I can perceive pain properly, then I can get the help that I need if I need it. But if I can't perceive pain, then I will just endure it and keep taking the same thing just so I don't feel it, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. It's scary. It's scary. It's scary. That's probably the most powerful word I can use there. I mean, it's amazing what these drugs can do. Absolutely. You know, we saw prescription drug abuse really take off in the 1990s with Oxycontin from Purdue. I mean, that was the huge wave of addiction that ultimately drew into to more heroin use, and then fentanyl, and where we are today. I mean, I talk about that quite a bit, what happened in the 1990s with the release of Oxycontin in 1996 by Purdue, and what that did to the whole landscape of drug use.
Mm. So in terms of Purdue Pharma, let's go through sort of, because for people who won't know, let's go through why that was such a huge problem and why it was such an eye-opener for people.
Yeah, so one of the things that is interesting and is there was this push in the medical community to treat pain, and there were a lot of these pain societies that popped up in the mid-1990s, and they actually ultimately made pain a vital sign, and they told doctors that they needed to treat pain, and if they didn't, they were cruel, and if they didn't, they were negligent. And they convinced the medical community, who for the most part around the world really hadn't, I mean, they've been using opioids, but not to the extent that they would after they were told that opioids weren't as addictive as they were thought to be, and that, again, they were cruel and negligent if they were not treating patients with especially chronic pain. And Purdue, they were able to get FDA approval for Oxycontin. Oxy means oxycodone, and contin means continuous. So the idea is, and this is how they got FDA approval, is that I mentioned earlier, opioids work, especially fentanyl work, and it doesn't take a whole lot, but they need in small doses for a long period of time. So the continuous was 12 hours. So the idea is you're getting oxycodone in your system over a 12-hour period. That's when you take the pill, it would just slowly release into your body. The problem is users realize that you could get these things wet, you could crush them and snort them, and you could get the entire pill immediately. And then it's like Purdue doubled down or something. They went from 10 milligrams to 20 to 30 to 40, and they just kept on increasing the amount of oxycodone in these pills. And it just became extremely addictive. And they were using crazy data telling folks that less than 1% of patients became addicted, and a lot of things that just weren't true. And they were whining and dining these doctors and bringing them to these Las Vegas or Reno and showering with gifts and parties, and it's crazy. And you look at their sales numbers, literally under $50 million in 1996 to over $1 billion in 2000. Just 4 years later, over $1 billion in sales. Yeah, incredible. And the problem was the genie was out of the bottle. I mean, these pills were extremely addictive. And literally, so now that's the 1996 to 2000 level. So you look at a lot of these doctors who realize that, whoa, this isn't a safe. I mean, it can be effective medicine for some people, but there are a lot of folks that are just absolutely addicted to these pills, whether they're abusing them or whether they just became addicted from overuse. And they started to either wean them off or cut them off. And what happens when you have an addiction, and your doctor, if you're getting your pills from your doctor and he or she tells you can't have them anymore, you either go to another doctor or you turn to the street. And a lot of these folks did exactly that. They started doctor shopping, where they'd have multiple doctors giving prescriptions to them, or they'd turn to the street. And if they couldn't get pills, they turned to heroin. And if you look at heroin use, it actually spiked during this time period. Actually, if you look at all prescription drug use, it actually spiked during this time period. Literally in 1997, 1998, every single prescription drug out there just spiked. It was incredible. And then it ultimately led to more heroin use. And then you also look at the number of people dying every year. I mean, like I said, when I was a police officer, 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 people a year. And during that time period, the late 1990s, we were up to like, let's say 8,000 or 9,000 people a year. And then it jumped to 13,000 and then 15,000 or 16,000 and then 25,000. And now we're at 110,000 just in the United States alone. So, I mean, like I said, the genie was out of the bottle. I mean, they released this pill. There was a lot of abuse. And then as they started to cut that back, at least the doctors, not Purdue, when the doctors started to cut that back and these folks were going to more doctors that would prescribe them, or they would just turn to the street and they'd get the either illegal counterfeit or other opioids off the street, or they'd turn to heroin. And like I said, at that time period, and that kind of really brings it all together, because at that time period, fentanyl was really just a cut. You know, you'd see a little tiny bit of fentanyl and heroin. And then the traffickers realized that, hey, it's the same thing, but it's a lot cheaper and a lot more effective, and we can get a lot more users. So it started to replace the heroin slowly. And like I said, now we're to the point where you can't really find heroin. It's very difficult to find heroin in some places, or in most places.
It's crazy because, so the Painkiller documentary, for those who wouldn't know about it, is like, it's from the perspective of the guys at the top. So Purdue Pharma, you know, the Sackler family. It's from the perspective of a sales rep who has a moral compass, but is pushed to not see the bad side of what Oxycontin was doing to people. They were sort of hiding that from her. And also it's from the perspective of someone who has a severe injury and is prescribed Oxycontin, a guy who owns his own business, and it ends up ruining his life. And, you know, the way that it was pushed to doctors and stuff, you know, they'd send in these women to doctors and they'd be like giving them gifts and like little pill teddies that they were handing out to all the doctors' offices and stuff like that. And it's like, this is something that is meant to be serious and to treat pain in people. Not, we're treating it like it's some sort of like sweets for kids, like with the teddies and things like that. And it's wild in the way that they got away with that, and that's never been, that side of it's never been punished.
Absolutely. And sadly, as I started to research more about opioids and just addiction and drug use in America, it's amazing. The Sackler family, at least Arthur Sackler, one of the three brothers, this wasn't the first time. I mean, he was involved in the campaign of Volume, which is diazepam. You know, from 1962 to 1982, it was the #1 selling pharmaceutical. It was the first $1 billion drug.
Wow.
And it was a very aggressive advertising. And guess who was behind that? Arthur Sackler and his advertising company. And you can literally go back in time and see some of the same things they were doing. Very, very aggressive campaign advertising and branding for other drugs in the 40s and 50s and 60s, all the way up until when they bought Purdue Frederick in 1952, I believe. And his brothers, Raymond and Mortimer, went to work for him. And Raymond is the Purdue, Sackler was the one everybody kind of knows from Purdue. But literally the same very, very aggressive marketing and advertising campaigns, and the way they, like you said, wind and dine these doctors, and it's shameless, absolutely shameless. And everyone always asks what's happening with the Sacklers now and the whole Purdue drama. It's so confusing. I tell folks to the internet and start reading, because there was a bankruptcy and then there's all kinds of judgments from the courts. And, you know, I saw an article not long ago that's saying that some of the family have a financial interest in some of the naloxone and other drugs that are used to save people now who overdose from opioids. I sure hope that's not true. I did read an article not long ago that suggested that. But,
wow.
Yeah, absolute craziness.
It wasn't even the doctors that they'd wined and dined. In obviously Painkillers dramatized slightly, so this may not be entirely correct, but in the documentary, the guy the guy at the FDA who was dealing with the case of Oxycontin refused them multiple times over a year on grounds he was like, look, it doesn't need to be this potent, and this is wrong with it, and it looks highly addictive. And I think it was within the year after, the guy had quit the FDA and was working for Purdue Pharma. And obviously they got approval because they'd wined and dined this guy so much that actually they'd taken away his morals, and he was now just a part of it.
Yeah, he did go to work for Purdue. And, you know, it's interesting. I mentioned the past and how, you know, we didn't learn from the past. You go back to, I believe it was 1959, FDA, I think his name was Henry Welch. Same type of issues that were going on. There was questions on whether or not there was accuracy in the advertising and branding of these pharmaceuticals that at least Arthur Sackler was kind of behind. But yeah, no, you're absolutely right. He went to work for Purdue. You got to kind of scratch your head and, you know, and make your own conclusion on what happened there. A lot of folks went to work for Purdue that were that we thought were fighting Purdue, or at least trying to hold them or make them accountable. You know, getting FDA approval was a big deal. You know, if you go back and look at the history of oxycodone, I mean, it was invented, I don't know, 1916, 1917, very, very, very addictive. And it wasn't until 1995, and it was literally under the promise that the pill would have a 12-hour release. And that's how literally got their FDA approval, is that release period. They weren't going to have the whole pill immediately because it was so addictive. They needed that short, that long release, just like the patches or the lollipops.
Yeah, it's absolutely insane. But now, obviously, we're 25 years on from when it really came to sort of explode and be sort of the start of that opioid epidemic. How are they dealing with the prescription drug problem now in comparison to how they were dealing with it in the first 10 years?
Numbers are still up. Really, it's the counterfeit drugs that are the problem now. Prescription drugs are so expensive, and sometimes they're harder to obtain. So a lot of folks just turn to the illegal market, the streets. And that's where the counterfeit pills, the counterfeit opioids have taken over. The oxys, the hydrocodone, I mean, they're just flooded the streets. And that's where the fentanyl comes in, because fentanyl is literally in everything. You know, not just cocaine and meth and heroin, but you know, right now it's 6 out of 10 pills seized contain at least 2 milligrams of fentanyl. 6 out of 10. Yeah, absolutely. It's the counterfeits have taken over. I mean, I don't want to say that's the future, because it's the present. It's here.
From someone who's worked and seen everything as it is, like, you've seen the problems on the streets, you've seen, you know, what the organizations can do and all this sort of thing. Is there more that can be done to prosecute these people, and should it be done quicker?
Yes. From my perspective, one of the most frustrating things is that we're not working together. I've said this before, but when I first went into management at the DEA, one of the things that I knew that I had to do was to start forming relationships with non-law enforcement folks in the treatment, prevention, recovery sector, and work with them, folks in the medical community. And I mean, 99% of the time, it was rare that they would pick up my call on the first ring. I mean, they had to convince themselves that I had good intentions, that I was actually trying to work with them, but they just had no interest in talking to law enforcement, let alone the DEA. But we have to get out of our silos. I mean, it's incredible the amount of people trying to do the right thing and save people, which is commendable. But why aren't we working together for those efforts? I say this all the time. I mean, if we surround ourselves with the right people, we can be a lot more effective, a lot more efficient. So that's a struggle. I mean, we need more aggressive prosecution. I can say that now that I'm retired. I've worked with a lot of great attorneys in my life, a lot of great prosecutors, but there are a lot who probably need to move on to a different career, because we need to take an aggressive stance, especially against these high-level folks that are bringing in thousands and thousands of pills, and they're just devastating our communities. They really are. And record numbers of people are dying, especially our young people, and it's sad. And we've all got to do more. You know, if I can say one more thing, the frustrating thing is that no one really seems to care unless you've been impacted by this. I remember I had a friend of mine, retired DEA agent out of Southern California. And he said, hey, look, less than 1% of the people, of parents, are actually going to show up to I do a lot of presentations specifically on opioids and fentanyl. And, you know, he said, most people aren't, your audience is going to be more of what you expect, your law enforcement, your first responders, or people impacted by this. And I was like, no, you know, and because I'd heard that before from other folks, and I'm seeing it firsthand. You know, most of the time I do speak to first responders, but a lot of times they'll be open to the public, and we'll do some aggressive advertising, trying to get more people in those seats. And 99% of the people that we get are literally been impacted by this, whether they're in recovery themselves or whether they're dealing with it in their families or their communities. Most people just, I don't know if it's out of sight, out of mind, or if we just want to bury our heads in the sand. I don't get it. I mean, we're losing 300 people a day just in this country. What's the rest of the world losing?
Yeah.
It's incredible what's happening.
It is so scary to think about. And yeah, that is a problem, I think. It's with anything though, isn't it? If you've never been affected by it, then you kind of push it aside and it's not anything to do with you. But as soon as it hits you or hits a family member or a friend, you become the biggest advocate for whatever it may be. And it's a way that needs to change, really.
I agree. Yeah, and I'm happy those people are trying to find an outlet for that pain and try to help more people so they don't have to feel the same things that they did after losing a son or a daughter or a close one. But we got to figure out how to get past that. I don't mean past the pain. I'm not trying to minimize or that at all. We need to figure out how to get past to the part where more folks are involved before those things happen, before their sons and daughters are taking these drugs. That's the goal, is to have a world conversation on how do we get ahead of this? How do we because it's going to get worse, and we've seen that.
After, did you say 28 years you've been in law enforcement? So after 28 years, what was it that led you to leave and find a new career path?
I love law enforcement. I love the DEA. I worked with great people, but I felt like I was young enough for something different in my life. I just needed that mental break. I needed to do something different. I've always had a love for training, and I've always had a love for helping people. And I thought, I can help people in a different capacity. I can help people through training. Of my 28-year career in law enforcement, 4 of those years were in a non-enforcement capacity. I worked at our training academy in Quantico, Virginia, and I did a lot of in-service training. I helped start the first leadership and development unit for the DEA, and that's when the seed was really planted, where I thought, wow, I really want to do this post DEA. And again, I turned 50 and thought, you know what, I'm still young. I still have a lot of passion left in me. And as much as I love this career and as much as I love putting bad people in jail, I needed to do something different. So that's where I am now.
Is there anything that, since you retired from law enforcement, was there anything that's made you think oh, I kind of want to go back? Or have you are you happy that you've left?
I am happy that I've left. It's a different career. I saw a lot of changes, especially in the last 2 or 3 years. Law enforcement from federal to local levels are struggling with recruitment. So I'm glad I don't have to mess with any of that stuff anymore. What I do miss the most is holding these folks accountable, the drug traffickers accountable, helping build these cases that we can bring to the U.S. Attorney's Office and prosecute these people and hopefully see them rot in prison. I miss that. I work with incredible, dedicated professionals. Very proud of the DEA and the organization that it is. A great place to work, a wonderful mission, and I do miss that, the camaraderie, the mission. But you know what? You got to turn the page sometime. You got to start new chapters sometime, and that's where I am now. So no regrets.
So Eagle 6 training you obviously created after you'd retired. So what specifically do you do? You obviously said you hold talks for first responders and also open to the public, but what is it that you do, and what is the sort of philosophy behind Eagle 6 training?
The philosophy really is to help people. So the big interest and the big thing that we do is leadership training. We like to work with leaders and just people in general to make them more effective. So that's our passion. I still work quite a bit with law enforcement. That's a career that I'm very familiar with, and I've navigated in that world for 28 years. So I know the language. I fit in. So I'm still involved in that, and it makes me happy to work in that profession still in that capacity. But ultimately leadership. The other thing is like you said, the opioids and the fentanyl. I actually have kind of a separate thing for that, where I hold anywhere from 2 to 4 hour discussions on opioids, specifically fentanyl. And I talk about a lot of the same things that you and I just spoke about today. I try to give a very comprehensive overview. I started that initially for just first responders, police officers. But then I realized pretty quick that the public was really interested in this, at least certain segments of it, medical community, a lot of recovery folks, treatment folks, prevention folks, things like that, business leaders. So I do that throughout the U.S. I think I'm at 20 or 21 presentations so far, which is great. I've been doing it since October. Probably have another 10 or 15 scheduled. I actually do it for free. I don't say that to brag or anything like that, but I pay my own when I travel throughout the U.S. I actually pay my own travel expenses if the organization can't bear those costs, because to me this conversation is too important to not to have. So that's taken up a lot of time, and that's fine. That's becoming it is a passion of mine, but that's becoming something that I want to do more and more of. And I'm actually looking at trying to get more into the schools. It's a whole different conversation. It's more about arming them with information so they can make better choices. I know kids are going to experiment with drugs, but I also know that they don't know the dangers. The drug landscape has changed. It's a lot different than it was 10 years ago. It's a lot different than it was 20, 30, 40 years ago. A lot of them don't know what fentanyl is. The marijuana they use nowadays is a lot different. It's a lot more potent. The vaping, just everything that the schools are facing. That's where I really want to get into is if I can prevent one person from making a choice that can kill them, then I'm successful, and that's where I think I need to be, is in that place that I can hopefully help these people.
It's amazing what you're doing. Just the fact you're willing to go and do these things for free, and just to push the message of what the problem is and how people can sort of deal with it is incredible. But so obviously you said there that that's what you want to do, is you want to push yourself into schools to sort of get into the prevention more than anything. But other than that, how do you see the next sort of 5 to 10 years going for Eagle 6?
Hopefully very good. This first year I'm trying to just build that foundation, consistent branding, getting the name out there, and giving quality training. So when people, think about the training or the presentations, they leave with a good taste, and refer me to other folks, and hopefully my phone rings and I get more business from it. So yeah, that's it's been a great first year. Like I said, just building that foundation is, and especially now. I mean, it's a tough economy, and when organizations are cutting back, unfortunately, one of the things they cut back is training, which blows my mind away, because we're asking our people to do more with less. So the last thing you want to do is say, hey, I need you to do more with less, and by the way, we're not going to give you any training or development. And that's frustrating. That's frustrating.
Towards the end, obviously, like with Eagle 6 and everything, I'll link that in the description so people can find it. But I always ask people at the end the same question, and that's, how would you like to be remembered?
As someone that cared and who wants to help people.
Amazing. Where can people find you on socials, online, everything like that?
So www.eagle, EAGLE6, just the number 6, training, TRAINING.com is my main website. If you'd like to learn more about my opioids and fentanyl presentation, please go to www.only2mg.com. So only2mg.com. And that page is dedicated just to the opioids and fentanyl presentation that I do. And it has my schedule on there. It has some resources for parents or folks that are looking for more information on opioids, so they can educate themselves and hopefully have those own conversations within their own four walls. I'm also on LinkedIn, Eagle 6 Training, or just Brian Townsend.
Amazing. All right. Thank you so much for coming on, Brian. I really appreciate your time.
Hey, thank you. I appreciate you as well, and thank you for the opportunity.
I really hope you enjoyed that episode with Brian. It's an intense one, but it was a really, really insightful episode into what the opioid problem is like and how it is affecting hundreds of thousands of people across America, and obviously the millions across the world as well. I think it's something that we need to bring more light to, and I feel like with what Brian is doing, he's doing a really good job of that over in the States. So I appreciate him. I appreciate his time. You can find all his links in the description below, so make sure to check him out. And yeah, I will see you next week for another episode. But please remember, like, subscribe, share the podcast, all that shit, because without it, the podcast doesn't do that well. So yeah, appreciate it. Cheers.